Right, so now we're into the second part of the first lecture. And I want to talk a bit about the ancient Greeks and ancient Greek philosophy. The Western tradition in philosophy is generally thought to start in ancient Greece. And there's some interesting questions about why that is. It seems to have been partly to do with the fact that they had or some of the Greek cities. One of the things about ancient Greece is that the culture that we think of as ancient Greece lasted for about 1,000 years and was spread over a wide area. I mean, there were colonies from all around the Mediterranean up the Black Sea. So different cities were run in different ways. So there wasn't really anything called the ancient Greek way of government, or if you ask what did the ancient Greeks think of this or that, it's like asking, what did the Americans think, or what did the European? I mean, it depends which Americans or which Europeans you ask, and when and how, right? Still, though, we can say a few things about the culture of ancient Greece. What's survived is the written part, and that was the part that was available to aristocrats. So it's a warrior aristocratic culture, deeply misogynist. You wouldn't wish to be a woman in ancient Greece. For the same reasons that you wouldn't wish to be a woman in much of human history. But it was a highly verbal culture. It was a culture in which things got decided by discussion, at least in Athens. In Athens in the 5th century, it seems that things got decided by discussion. And that led to a whole culture, an elite culture, an aristocratic culture, in which talk was important, in which it was important to be able to talk persuasively. Partly because citizens were expected to take part in the political life of the city. So, the male citizens over a certain age would gather in the agora, in the marketplace, and debate and discuss and decide, whether to go to war or not. That was usually what they were having to decide, because they were at war half the time. The other reason was because they had this system of law where there were trials, but first of all, you weren't allowed to hire counsel. So if you were accused of a crime, you had to defend yourself in person. You couldn't hire a barrister to speak for you. So you better be able to speak persuasively. And the other thing is that juries were big. Juries could be, a couple of hundred people, rather than the 12 people that we have in juries here now. And also the rules of evidence weren't quite so well developed. So there are all kinds of things that lawyers aren't allowed to say because they're unfair in courts now. But those rules hadn't really been worked out. So if you were accused of a crime, you would find yourself defending yourself in front of a large crowd of people without a judge keeping the crowd in check and reminding them of the rules and so on. So again, you really had to be able to speak well. And we have philosophical records of this. This is of philosophical interest to us. Why? Well, because the first philosopher who we have really extended writings for is Plato. there were fragments of previous philosophers' writings, and we know a bit about previous philosophers in addition to their writings because later philosophers wrote about them. Aristotle was a great one for summarizing other people's views. He more or less invented the literature review, right? So we know a lot about what Aristotle thought previous philosophers were thinking because he wrote it all down. Well, Plato is the first one whose own words we have in any kind of quantity. But the main character in Plato's writing was Socrates. So Socrates didn't write anything. But Plato wrote these dialogues where Socrates was the main character. And Socrates was well known to everybody, so Plato couldn't just write any old stuff and put it in Socrates' mouth and expect to get away with it. So we think that Socrates, as he appears in Plato's writing, at least early on, probably isn't too far away from the real historical Socrates. This is one of many parallels between Socrates and Jesus. Jesus also didn't write anything, but people who seem to have known him wrote up his life. So we have something. So if you read Plato's dialogues, one of the first ones that he wrote was the Euthyphro. And in that we meet Socrates on his way to court. And he bumps into somebody else who's also on his way to pursue a court case. So we learn a bit about ancient Greek law from the Euthyphro. Okay, so we have this ancient Greek culture where being able to speak well was terribly important in order to for male citizens, right? For male citizens who had survived doing their military service. Mature men, because you might be called upon to take part in politics, and you might have to defend yourself in court, or you might want to prosecute somebody, which again would require you to be able to speak effectively. So some of the first higher education, the first thing that we have that looks like higher education is education in plausible speaking. And this was provided by rhetors and sophists, right? So a rhetor is a teacher of rhetoric. A rhetor is a person who teaches you how to speak persuasively. And they didn't do this by teaching any kind of method. What they had were lots of examples. And there were sort of standard examples that you could follow. So they hadn't made a science of it, but there were some. So it was a bit like, writing a pop song. I mean, nobody's written a mathematical formula for it, but there've been so many, and the successful ones have been copied so much that it's very easy for pop songs to sound formulaic. Well, speeches in ancient Athens were a bit like that. So the most famous rhetor was a chap called Gorgias, and Gorgias lived from 483 to 378, it says here. So end of the 5th century and most of the 4th century BC. So he's contemporary with Socrates, and the young Plato would have known about him and possibly even seen him. Now, why am I telling you all this about Gorgias? Well, another of the professions, and Gorgias was also part of this, was to be a teacher of virtue, right? So you had people would hire these characters to teach their youth, their young men, their kind of adolescents, their teenage lads, virtuous behaviour, and persuasive speech. And Gorgias was the champion. So Gorgias would turn up, go to the marketplace and shout, "Give me a theme." He was like improv. He would say, "Give me a topic and I will speak persuasively on that topic." One of his great speeches, we have one speech from Gorgias, which is the encomium of Helen. Now, Helen, you will remember, was in a way responsible for the Trojan War that lasted 10 years and costed the lives of most of the Greek heroes of that generation. And it's described by Homer in the epic poem, the Iliad. Now, the Iliad was like Shakespeare for the English or the British, right? It was the piece of literature that you had to learn in order to be an educated person. The Trojan War took place centuries before the time we're talking about, the time of Gorgias and Plato and Socrates. It was like, I don't know, talking about Helen would be like talking about, I don't know, Guinevere or, Maid Marian or somebody, right? I mean, some woman from the remote historical past. So what do they know? What do we know about Helen? Well, from legend, we know that she was responsible for the Trojan War because she left her husband in Greece and went off to Troy with her new lover. So everybody knows her as a wicked woman, right? As a woman whose adultery caused a 10-year war and the deaths of a generation of heroes. So Gorgias rocks up in the marketplace and says, "I'm going to get her off. I am going to explain to you why she is unjustly maligned and why none of that was her fault." And this, nobody really cares, right? The point is, this is a party trick. This is him being flash. This is him it's a bit like writing the history essay about why Hitler was a good thing for Germany in the long run, right? It's not that you believe it, it's that you do it as a display of cleverness. So this is what Gorgias used to do. This is what Gorgias would do. He would, in order to gain pupils, he would put on this display of, I can say anything and make it persuasive. Now, Plato thought this was terrible. Why? Well, because Plato thought this kind of thing was responsible for the decay of Athenian democracy and the way in which the Athenian democracy collapsed and was replaced by tyranny. And in particular, he held this kind of thing, this kind of fake news, if you like, this kind of false expertise, responsible for the death of Socrates, because Socrates was put on trial. And Socrates was held responsible for corrupting the Athenian youth and for inventing new gods, right, which was a capital crime. Heresy, if you like, or blasphemy. So Socrates goes on trial, and we have a record. In fact, we have two records of Socrates' trial, one by Plato and one by somebody else. Anyway, in Plato's version, Socrates is the sacrificial lamb. Socrates upholds his principles. He says, look, first of all, I'm innocent. And second, the only reason you want to put me on trial for my life is because I've been going round revealing that people who claim to know something about statecraft or about medicine or about generalship or about virtue don't really. I've been going round as a philosopher revealing people to be frauds, revealing powerful people whose claim to power is based on their expertise I've been going around showing that they haven't got the expertise that they claim to have, and that's why you all hate me, and that's why you want me to put me to death. I'm not going to step back from that. I'm not going to step off, because that's what I've done. That's what I'm about. So my integrity prevents it. And so he was found guilty, right? But he's given a chance to escape, because they had this kind of tradition where they would find you guilty of a capital crime. They would hold you in prison until it was time to execute you, but they would kind of leave the door open. And if your friends came and spirited you away and you just disappeared, right? So that you could kind of turn a sentence of death into exile just by slipping off. Socrates refused, and there's another dialogue in which Plato has Socrates explaining that he's lived by the laws all his life. The city has raised him and fed him, and that to abuse the laws of the city at this point would be dishonourable. And he, having been raised and fed and cared for by the city, he should obey its laws to the end, and therefore he refused to save himself by slipping away. So this is the other way in which Socrates is parallel with Jesus, is that he has opportunities to save himself. He's condemned by the mob. He has opportunities to save himself by stepping back from his principles, but he refuses. And in his death scene, he explains that, well, it's not a problem anyway, because what will happen is that his soul will be freed from his body, and he will be able to commune with the pure forms of things that can be understood by the intellect, so that he will be, free to appreciate the form of the good without the flesh getting in the way. Okay, so that's quite a bit about Socrates, and why Plato cared, about the sophists. So Plato tells a story in which the sophists are the bad guys, and he explains that really reason should be in charge, both of the individual and of the city, and the emotions should be kept in check, and they should be kept in check by what he calls spirit. So he has a three-part model of the mind, or the psyche, with reason, spirit or courage, and your appetites. And reason has to govern, and your spirit or your courage keeps your appetites in check, and you will be but rhetoric and the stuff that Gorgias teaches is bad. Why? Because what it tries to do is put the appetites in charge at the expense of reason. Well, now the sophists have answers. And one of the sophist answers is that, actually, reason and the feelings, the emotions, aren't as separate as all that. They're not as separate as all that. They're not so easy to separate. And Plato kind of knew this too. And there's a dialogue of his which I recommend to you, called the Symposium. Symposium is Greek for drinking party. So if you're invited to a symposium by Greeks, ancient Greeks, it'll be a booze up. And in this dialogue, we meet the characters, and they agree that they're not going to have a hard session because they're still feeling a bit delicate from the previous night. So they water the wine down, and they decide that instead of having a proper session on the booze, they will have a speechifying contest. Right? So people make speeches, And Socrates makes this speech in which he explains that what is a philosopher? A philosopher is somebody who wants wisdom, who yearns for wisdom, right? So he tells this story about a philosopher. A philosopher. If a philosopher isn't somebody who has wisdom, that would be a god. And a philosopher is somebody who lacks wisdom, but who knows they lack it and feels the lack and desires it. And he tells a kind of erotic story about this. So he says, love was explained to him by a wise woman called Diotima. She's a seer. She's a prophetess. She can predict natural disasters. And she explains to Socrates that love isn't a god because love is incomplete. Love is desire for something that you haven't got. And because love is incomplete, it isn't a god, it's a spirit. And philosophers are like that. And as a result of talking to Diotima, Socrates is able to explain that you start off feeling lust for another human being. Boys, in the case of aristocratic Greek men, there's a highly homoerotic culture. I mean, women, great for making babies, but the real powerful erotic relationship was with a male youth. So you start off lusting after particular bodies, and then you start to appreciate the beauty of the human body as such. So at that point, I guess you stop lusting after individual boys and start appreciating statues of well-honed bodies. But then you become yet more spiritual, and you start appreciating the form of beauty as such. So you don't have to look at statues. You can just think about beauty, the idea of beauty. The very idea of beauty is itself beautiful. And you go, yeah, okay. And once you're appreciating the form of beauty, you're then able to understand the form of the good and other pure forms, right? So it's a kind of ladder that takes you from lusty animal human desires up to a desire for wisdom. So you start off desiring the bodies of fit boys, and you end up, and this may just be the effect of age, actually, who knows, you end up desiring wisdom. So Plato tells a story in which the appetites and the intellect are actually all mixed up together. So maybe Plato is a bit of a sophist as well. Maybe actually in campaigning against the sophists, maybe Plato is revealing himself to be the champion sophist of them all. In the same way that Plato banned poets from his ideal city, but he did that using very powerful dramatic techniques. Okay, so I've been talking for a while now. I want you to oh yes, one last thing. In the reading, you will have read a bit about the ancient Greeks and a bit about how Socrates embodies the spirit of philosophy. He goes around asking critical questions and so on and so forth. And that it's all about, debate me, you coward kind of thing, right? So it's so the fact that Socrates tells his story about learning about wisdom from Diotima is interesting on two counts. One, he's learning about wisdom from a woman, not a goddess. Although she's a wise woman and a seer, a prophetess, she's still a human mortal. So it's kind of singular moment where one of these aristocratic men actually listens to a woman. I'm not, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that. I know it must be important because misogyny was so much a part of the culture. Maybe because she was instructing him about love. But the other thing is, she's not present. So the whole virtue of the conversational frame is that you're supposed to be able to interrogate the speaker and say, yes, you say this, but let me ask you critical questions. Right? The asking of critical questions it's what critical thinking is all about. It's what informal logic is all about. It's what philosophy is all about. And this is part of the oral quality of ancient Greek aristocratic culture. Plato tells a story in which the Greeks learn writing from the Egyptians. It's a feature of the culture that the ancient Egyptians were already ancient, right? The pyramids had been up for 2,000 years before Socrates was born, right? The pyramid builders were as far back from Socrates as Jesus is from us. And Plato tells a story about, at the start of one of his dialogues, where he has the Egyptians saying, you Greeks, you'll always be children because you live in an earthquake zone. Whenever you get a bit of culture going, as soon as it starts to approach adolescence, an earthquake comes along and flattens it and you have to start again. We Egyptians, we've been there since the year dot, right? We want wisdom, come to Egypt. Excuse me. So the Greeks knew that they were young compared with surrounding civilizations in the Near East, with the Assyrians and the Persians and the Egyptians. Anyway, one of the stories that Plato tells about the ancient Egyptians is that they got given the gift of writing by a god, and the Egyptians say, "Are you sure about this? We will lose the art of memory. Also, you can't interrogate a text, right? A book tells you what it has to say, but you can't prod it in the lapel, poke it just underneath its collarbone and say, oh, yeah, but what about this?" So this is really important for ancient Greek philosophical culture, and it's something that Plato claimed to believe in. So it's kind of suspicious that Socrates' doctrine about the nature of love and the erotic quality of philosophy, erotic in the sense that it's a yearning for something you don't have, namely wisdom, all of this is put in the mouth of somebody who isn't present. So it isn't possible for the others to question Diotima because she isn't there. All they have is Socrates' report of what she has to say. Does Plato actually violate his own standards there? Possibly he does. Okay, what I want you to do now is read the first chunk of the Plato dialogue called the Meno, or the Meno. I don't know enough Greek to know how to pronounce it. Go as far as you like. If you find it really heavy going, don't push on if you're not getting anything out of it. If you get as far as the bit with the slave boy and the geometry, that would be great. You can stop there if you like. I mean, if you're enjoying it, crack on, right? I mean, don't let me prevent that. But as far as dutiful reading goes, if you get halfway to the bit with the slave boy and the diagram, that'll be fine. If you get all the way to the bit with the slave boy and the diagram, that would be great. I will be delighted. All right, do that, and I'll talk to you in a minute.